Greetings, everybody. I hope you can see my Yin-Yang shirt here. My talking to you has a lot of yin and yang. Over here, it's early in the morning, where a fair amount of you are in Europe or the Middle East. Of the old world. I'm over in the new world, over on the Pacific Ocean side of the North American continent. Over here on this side of America, though I have very obviously these Northwestern Europe genes, and we are speaking this Northwestern Europe language, especially since the Second World War, a huge amount of old world wisdom migrated to the US on the Pacific side from Asia. And so Macrobiotics was one of the several streams of Far Eastern wisdom that streamed into my life. My uncle had been in the Second World War and was in China and brought back all kinds of stories and lots of photographs of China. And I also met a man who was imprisoned during the Second World War in Japan, who returned there and became one of America's first Zen masters, Robert Aitken. And so I have had that influence. I was born just before the Second World War started. And in the fear after Pearl Harbor, huge numbers of West Coast Japanese citizens, American citizens, were rounded up and placed in internment camps. That was actually a fear that they might support invasion of the coast. And in my home state of Washington, the Columbia River flows south right through the center of the state and demarks east from west. And none of the Japanese were moved away from my hometown of Spokane. And so I grew up with a number of Japanese American folks. And lots of Japanese American men volunteered for the Second World War and served in the most decorated battalion of the entire US Army, where they served in Italy. And so when they returned to my hometown, they were greatly revered. When I went to college, I did a major in linguistics, and due to kind of wide interest and before interdisciplinary studies were available, I resorted to doing an entire second major to kind of get to the areas I was interested in. So I then also did full studies in psychology. And just as I finished my senior year of psychology, I ran across a hugely influencing book called Psychotherapy, East and West by Alan Watts, and also ran across his Nature, Man and Woman, both of which deeply touched into the Zen and the Taoist traditions out of Asia, and reshaped my entire thinking on psychology. My linguistics had allowed me to see that Western tongues tended to emphasize the relationship of that we signify by the word or, whereas in the yin and yang, we had instead a relationship of andness instead of orness. Or is very Western. It allowed us, when we use it carefully enough to avoid its several terribly inherent contradictions, logic flaws, it allowed the West to develop objectivity, and objectivity gave rise to science and technology that has been so much our inheritance from the West. But in the East, by using that inclusive thing, where we were looking at allness, it served to give us a more integrated view and to see holisticness in contrast to separateness. To our topic today, I am personally a little shaky, for I just learned of the death of a very close friend yesterday afternoon, and am emotionally pretty vulnerable right now. But that's how it should be. My experiences with death, the first significant one happened when I was still a teenager, and my father had a massive heart attack in the middle of the night. And I was called, and though I could not hear a heartbeat, I gave him artificial mouth-to-mouth respiration until the ambulance arrived. And still remember being prickled by his beard. It was early Monday morning before work, and so he hadn't shaved over the weekend before going back to work. And remember the sour, sour taste in his overnight mouth as I tried to revive him. And I had to get my mom's purse. My mom and brother rode down in the ambulance to the hospital. He never revived. He was pronounced dead there. But I had to get that and listen to the ambulance go off in the distance. And for the next 10 years, every time I heard an ambulance, all the hackles on the back of my neck would be standing. A number of you know me from French Meadows, and I met Diana Lynn, and we spent 24 years as a couple, and Diana was an only child, and we were asked to help by her parents to see them through the ends of their lives at home. And we took on that task that turned out to be almost unimaginable and quite difficult. Diana later wrote, my father died like a firecracker. He was gone in 20 minutes from a stroke. And my mother died like a store going out of business, in that Stella died over a 3-year period, more and more and more faded, until finally into a coma. And it was so hard for us. We had moved them out to live beside us, and we lived out in the country. It was wonderful. The west coast of North America, the west third of the country, is all wrinkled with the migration of the continental plate and wonderful mountains. And so we got to live out in that country for a quarter of a century. And anyway, in my mid-70s, that became overwhelming and much. And at that time, I retired and came over into California Central Valley and Chico, California, which had been for half a century kind of the West Coast original center of macrobiotics. When Ohsawa had left Japan, went to visit Schweitzer in Lambaréné, Africa, came back to Europe, and then over to the East Coast of America in New York City, Khrushchev was pounding his heel on the podium of the United Nations over the worst moment of the Cold War up to that point, over a spy plane incident. And Ohsawa said to the macrobiotic community, you who consider rice to be your principal food, perhaps you should consider going where rice grows. And so about half of the community decided to follow that advice, and 17 families caravanned en masse across the country to California's Central Valley. Ohsawa had sent out kind of missionaries, and Evelyn and Micho stayed with the people on the East Coast, and then they migrated to Boston. And the 17 families included Cornellia and Herman Aihara, and they came out to the Central Valley. And when they looked at the map, they were surprised to see Cornelia's first name almost spelled out. Her first name was Chico. And so when they saw Chico on the map, on that basis, they decided to come to Chico, California, and started Chico-san, the first company that contracted to get the organic whole grain rice grown and did the importation of the Japanese foodstuffs, the seaweed, the miso, the soy sauce, and other such things. My family was involved in it. I lived with the Aiharas in San Francisco before they returned to Chico, and actually set up in Oroville and did a little farm. But I knew Chico as a source of macrobiotic friends and of good food. And so I've been here this last 10 years. And one of the most interesting groups that I came across was the Alliance for the Support and Education of Death and Dying. It was founded by two women. One of them was a Quaker woman who was not trained in Quaker theology, but a more universal form called chaplaincy. The chaplains often serve in military and prisons to meet the spiritual needs of a wide base of different groups. The other woman had a young daughter who came down with a very severe life-threatening disease and expected to lose that daughter within a year or two. But the daughter lived on for almost 10 years with many crises happening. And afterwards, after the doctor had died, that woman, Malama McNeil, found that she was especially capable in dealing with people who were going through trauma of loss and health crisis and such, and was working as a death doula. So our group met one Sunday evening a month at a big community room in our library that was a full media center facility. And so we could use computers and media and internet, and we would do all kinds of different programs to do things. One activity that we didn't do on those Sunday nights is that in the vernacular here in America, it might even go back to Benjamin Franklin. There is a saying that the only certainties in life are death and taxes. And in the US, April 15th is the day in which everybody has to pay their taxes. And so we would have a day called After Taxes. And we would have a great community day in the great large downtown cemetery. In April, it was spring weather, and we would just all walk and talk through the cemetery and just be aware and read headstones to see what they say, etc. Some of the other activities that we did is we tried to just help people be ready for dying, to be able to get their affairs in order. And a lot of that involved issues around health and what to do in the times of dying that were often health crises. And so there were documents called advanced health directives, in which you would legally write down your choices about, do I wish to have intervention when I am dying, or would I like to just be allowed to die in the moment? That was an issue here because in ambulances, to preclude legal challenges, the ambulance drivers and attendants will immediately do everything they can to revive the person they pick up on their way to the hospital. And so you need to have documentation to hand them if you wish not to have that sort of interference involved in your lifetime. The time that I came into macrobiotics was in the 60s. And we rode that great big demographic population bulge through the years, and we're very much part of the 60s natural nature-inclined movement. I did Back to the Land. There were all the various sorts of rebellions that went on as hippies, as peace protesters, etc. When that group reached the age I am now, that then became a real concern for the people involved in our Alliance for the Support in Death and Dying. And so a lot of people were concerned, how can we die naturally without intervention? And how can we have our corpses disposed of in a holistic manner? In America, there's almost all body disposal is done through funeral homes and mortuaries. And a lot of that is very shielding in how it presents death to the public, and often included embalming bodies so that they would not spoil, so that they could be put on display in a funeral, in an open cast funeral, etc. Whereas people where we were interested instead of how could bodies most naturally go back to nature. And so we created what's called a green burial subgroup within us, and I was quite active in that and trying to find where can people's bodies be disposed of naturally. A very nice serendipity was occurring because there was great appreciation for wild and natural areas, and such groups as the Nature Conservancy was privately buying up wonderful pieces of nature and conserving it to kind of supplement what was being done by governments and setting up natural parks, et cetera. And it turned out that there were a number of Nature Conservancy sites that were amenable to having people's bodies disposed of. And so a person's body could just be wrapped in a shroud, and it could be taken out on these pieces of nature land and buried, and the location marked by geopositioning, and it just being a completely natural thing. But most burial, especially in cities, is done because of population concentration, is done in graveyards. And so we were working on where might we find a graveyard that could have a section that the burial would be in those more natural conditions. And so that was an area we worked on for several years. Another area that fit into part of the kind of political, cultural ethos of the US was that any West Coast states where trade with other countries happen exposes folks to other cultures and tends to create a more kind of liberal and accepting ethos. That happened here in America so much that using a term from looking at North America at a map of calling it the left coast came from political leftness. And the three Pacific states were very progressive in their views and values. They were amongst the first states to legalize cannabis. And all three states also legalized the process of physician-assisted suicide. Sometimes the act of dying can be very difficult. And if you ever see that, it changes you. I don't know if this is showing up in the right perspective, but I'm showing this book called How We Die that was by Sherwin Newland, who wrote about the typical forms that a death takes when it involves different systems of the body. And he was a physician, and he at some times asked people to take on kind of experimental treatments during dying that were not for their assistance. They were really just for gaining scientific knowledge. And in some of those, he saw people's suffering extended through that. And he became an advocate then of being able people to choose personal euthanasia if it was really tough conditions. And that became instigated as law in all three Western states here, California, Oregon, and Washington. Part of the problem with that is that there were holes in it sometime. It didn't fit everybody, and there were many parts of the country that didn't have it. And so there arose a lay movement, a home movement of being able to intentionally die if one felt they needed to, under one's own directing. And that got introduced especially by a book by Derek Humphreys called Final Exit, where people were hoarding barbiturates intentionally and then taking them all at once to die if they felt it was needed. The problem with it was that all of that chemical medical stuff often made people sick, and they would often vomit it back up before they died. And yet those very serious barbiturates also harmed them, and so they ended up worse off than they had started. And so in intentional dying, some people had taken the method of doing it very slowly by stopping eating and drinking, and was something that happened then in usually a period of a few weeks. It was recognized that there was another kind of fasting that one could do, and that was a fasting of breath. And yet, if you tried to use a bag over your head like they did in the killing fields, the buildup of CO2 elicits a whole set of emergency and anguish and alarm senses within the body. And so what was necessary was to not take in any more oxygen, but at the same time to get rid of all of the body's CO2. And people were able to do that by breathing inert gases. One of the places they started was with the gases that were available to inflate balloons in the toy stores. They had bulk red canisters of helium gas, and people were using that and then making a hood with a tube and breathing just the helium, and their breathing out would displace around the collar the CO2, and so they would be unconscious in a few minutes and had died within 10 or 15 minutes. But helium became rare and was unavailable any longer. They were diluting it, so there was oxygen in those tanks. And people then discovered that they could use the industrial gases for welding. They could use pure nitrogen, which was quite comfortable, as we are breathing 80% nitrogen on every breath we take. And so Derek Humphreys' book, Final Exit, was describing how to, its revisions going past the barbiturates, then we're talking about how to use those gases for doing that. And our group, our Alliance for the Death and Dying, always had pamphlets out from the Final Exit Society on education, and the Final Exit Society even had services where they would come to your home if you really seriously wish to die early and had good reason for doing that. And I researched that personally a lot, and even ended up buying my own exit. I have it stored downstairs on a shelf should it ever come necessary, and all of my sons know what that intent and purpose is, and we'll follow that direction. Some of the other things that we did was like Macrobiotics' desire to take over being self-directing. That same value was shared by many of the people in the Alliance. And so they wanted to die at home, to forego a pretty conventional dying in hospitals that was typical in the US. And towards that, we even did classes on how to take care of a person's body after they died. And we actually all enacted that one day. We had many tables there. And so a third of us were laid out individually on the tables. And the other 2/3 of the group of us then tended that person just like they were actually tending a body of physically with touch, miming all of the washing of the body and preparing it. I had that happen to me and found that to be an incredibly moving experience, to be treated with that degree of tenderness and reverence, gentleness. And that brings me to another thing that I knew Gannat much appreciated, that we evolved a way of being in that tender space and a grieving space at the same time. And so we created just pure gatherings for nothing but grieving. We would have a little talisman that we would pass around, and whoever held the talisman could speak at that time. And people would talk about where the sorrow existed in their lives. And hearing people express that was incredibly evocative of being able to access one's own areas of grief and sorrow. So we had great boxes of Kleenex scattered through the room where everybody could be wiping away the tears. And hearing people's expression of sorrow brought people emotionally closer together, amazingly so. It so deepened connection between people to be able to share that grief. I find that grief is unusual. I mean, grief is sometimes unexpected. I know some things will regularly evoke it, but other times I'm suddenly just engulfed in tears. And I find that most often that seems to be evoked by poignant moments. They aren't necessarily even sorrow. I even see moments of reunion where lots of people are moved to tears and grateful for it. I see I'm getting kind of up near the end of the time.
Yes, I'd like to, with your permission, offer people the chance to ask questions, if there are any, or give comments. We have about 5 minutes, I would say, to go. Any comments, ideas, questions?
Okay. Hi, Hugh. It's Mike. How you doing?
I'm good to see you.
And here I get the video on, and I can get into the picture.
Hello, old friends.
Hi, good to see you. I want to talk with you and get your view on the losses that we have in the community, and how did you see the discharge of that grief on the West Coast and on the East Coast? There was a big memorial service for Michio at the time, and we had a get together a few weeks ago out of Beckett, and it seemed to me that there was a lot of stuck grief still in the community. And I wanted to run that by you and see if that's something that you were familiar with. That was a phenomenon that you had perceived yourself.
Thank you. Yeah. I had lived up in Washington, Michael, and had come down to California and knew of Chico-san in California and stopped by there to make contact with the macrobiotic community. Up in Washington, in some of the health food stores, I had only seen mimeographed literature that was available. I'm trying to think of some of Blake Rankin and some of the other people that had started early stores up there. When I arrived at Chico-san, everybody was gone except Betty Kennedy. They were all down in Los Angeles for the memorial service for George Ohsawa. And so I was surprised by that, and did not get to participate in that or see that. So my first experience with tragedy, and well, there were a number of students that died. When we started out, I remember Herman and Cornellia talking about lots of the students, hippie girls and boys, that we were all young, and with them being senior Ohsawa's second generation, there were not any deaths amongst macrobiotic leaders for a long time, but there were often people who came into the community that were very ill, and we lost those people regularly. But Herman's death was the first one that I experienced. I had been very close with the Aiharas. In the older days before there was a kitchen staff at the community, Cornelia had one person help and also would take up the Vega staff and then use volunteers. And my then wife, the mother of my two grown sons, was Cornelia's kitchen assistant during that time. They would come down to Sacramento, where we had relocated to be near a Waldorf school. And they would come down to do shopping for Japanese foodstuffs, and so would visit us regularly. And so we also were close to them. And so when Herman died, Cornelia asked if I would be one of the pallbearers for him. And as one of the senior students, I was called right after he had had his heart attack and went over and spent that week hanging out in parts of the Vega Center and spending most of the time up there at the intensive care unit, and a whole bunch of us. And Herman had not recovered enough in a week's time, and in that he was going to be completely invalided and on machines, et cetera. There had been the decision made to turn the machinery off and to let him die. And so we had a Buddhist funeral for him. And in the Buddhist funeral, in contrast to Western funeral homes, when my father died, they had him laying in view, but they had made his face up with rouge on his cheeks and a little bit of lipstick to give him a living appearance. But with Herman, none of that was done in the Buddhist funeral. And Herman's death colors were natural. His body was a natural pale ashen gray. And I recognize how seeing that naturalness allowed better processing and understanding that death had occurred. As pallbearers, I was sitting up on the front row, the six of us, and just across the aisle, Cornelia and Mari couldn't do it, but Jiro was there. And the people would go up to the casket and look in the casket and would make gassho, bowing to Herman's corpse, and then would turn around and bow to all of us. And sitting in the front row, I was then looking in the faces of everybody's sorrow in that happening. And at the end, pallbearer, when we got up, part of our work task included ritually going over to Cornelia and bowing to her. And that was the most painful moment of the entire funeral. I'm okay. I got a few tears here.
Tears are okay.
Anyway, in kind of the funeral things that we did over the internet like this, it was a little less personal. But being able to, at the term of Herman's dying, of actually seeing his body greatly deepened the experience. And at the funeral, we also, many folks spoke. And so we got to hear many of the people that were close to them and experience that directly. And that celebrating that together made it real and gave a lot of support in the community to that death and dying. I'm not sure I even quite remember what the question was.
You gave a brilliant answer. It didn't really matter. It was just an opportunity to ask you to share with us, and I thank you. And I thank you for your presentation today. It was really very much from the heart, and I really appreciate that. So thank you so much.